Thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to be here to talk with you a little bit about this thing called ungrading. And I just want to say before we get started that the first time I heard about ungrading, I felt very resistant, like extremely resistant, almost hostilely resistant to the notion that we could just like get rid of grades because it's so deeply ingrained in our culture. And so if you are feeling skeptical or uncertain or even a little defensive, I totally get it. And I do think that it takes several exposures and some time marinating on this concept to feel comfortable with embracing it. There are a handful of people at Chat State who are doing some experiments, some forays into ungrading. Bill Taylor is one of them. I'm just kind of starting, but because I'm doing the persistence project this semester, I didn't want to change grading too, because I don't want to contaminate my data. So I'm just kind of thinking in a future oriented way about how I might try to do this in my own class. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and hopefully this is all going to go off without a hitch. And I encourage you to interrupt anytime with any questions or thoughts that you might have. But let's go ahead and dive in. And I want to start with this question, which is just share with us your feelings about grading. When you hear the word grading, what kinds of feelings come to mind? So this is a poll everywhere. Let me see if this is, it's not showing up, is it? Oh my goodness.
Not really.
Hold on. I'm gonna make it happen.
We have faith in you.
I know, thank you. Appreciate that. Let's try this. It may be because I made this at home and now I'm at work. And why wouldn't it work? Okay, let me put this into, let's see if this works. All right, so I'm going to put this in the chat and this will maybe work. So you go to pollev.com. Norell 09. Oops. Try that. And I'll stop sharing this and start sharing this. There we go. Oh, it's 095. Oh, I can't. Thank you for your patience. Oh my goodness. Okay. We are going to make this happen. So it's up at the top, pollev.com/Liz Norell. There we go. Someone used the word love. I'm so excited about that.
Oh no, I messed it up. Sorry, mine was really long. I made mine a sentence. So I'm messing up the word cloud. I'm sorry.
It's okay, Julie. It's okay. Everybody gets grace today. So I like the word stressful and love, feedback, dialoguing, necessary. Complicated. Maybe that's complicated feelings. So when I talk to people about grading, I often hear a lot of dread or stress or overwhelm or just like not happy feelings about the prospect of grading. And I think a lot of that has to do with, I mean, for starters, just the volume of grading that we're doing. But it also often feels like we invest a lot of time into trying to give fair and useful feedback that may not, in the end, result in any seemingly positive outcomes for our students. By which I mean, we might spend a lot of time putting together really careful feedback that never gets read, because ultimately it feels like sometimes students are just more interested in the grade that they get. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Wait. Maybe? Yeah. All right, so I when I think about grading, this is kind of the architecture of my thoughts about it, because I think oftentimes we have this, people in our lives have this perception of what it is that we do, and it's often very, you know, like the Goodwill Hunting example of like helping students, we're going to reach out and make this connection, and it just feels like we spend most of our time with big stacks of paper trying to give feedback and wanting to be fair. But this is not what we got into teaching to do. At least it's not what I got into teaching to do. And so then the question becomes like, what are we hoping to get out of this? So I'm not going to do this as a poll everywhere, because clearly that's not working well. But tell us in the chat, what is the thing that you hope that students will leave your class knowing, understanding, being able to do? Like, what is that overriding thing that you hope they get out of your class? And, you know, backwards design often begins with this question. So this is a big part of what we're hoping faculty will be doing for their classes as we transition into 7 weeks. It's thinking about those big things. And yeah, Tanya, how do you choose just one? Maybe it's not just one. Maybe it's 2 or 3, but those big things. So for me, teaching American government, the biggest thing that I hope students get out of my class is an understanding of how to engage in politics without it turning into hatred of people who disagree with them. So underneath that, there's a lot. You've got to understand how the system works. You've got to understand how you fit in the system. You've got to understand how to engage with people who disagree with you. And you have to be committed to this idea that we're not going to hate each other at the end of that. But the really big one is, how do we interact with politics without getting really angry and hating other people? That's my big goal in my class. And so if you can start there, then you start to ask yourself questions about, okay, well, how do I get my students there? And how do I convince myself that they've arrived, that they've achieved that? And that's where the grading comes in. So I think oftentimes we create a syllabus and a course design that helps students get there, but we always kind of come back to this. And I know you've all seen this, because there are memes and t-shirts and coffee mugs and stickers that all emphasize this notion that if we just got our students to read the syllabus, if they could just read the syllabus, then they could do what they needed to be successful and to achieve that big goal. But I want to suggest that we can adopt a different kind of mindset as we try to think about these tricky topics of student motivation and student learning. And these are the kinds of things that I'm always thinking about. And it starts with this: how do we relate to our students? So I want you to just take a moment and ask yourself, what do you think about your students? You don't have to put it in the chat. Just take a moment and think about that. Because your students are absolutely asking themselves that question about you. So if we went and polled your students right now, how would they answer the question of what do you think about your students? Grading becomes a really big factor in how students think we assess them. And I think that there's a different way. Because as Kevin Gannon tells us, students cannot succeed in learning environments where they think that they are undervalued or devalued or seen as somehow less than. And oftentimes grading is about sending those messages, not necessarily intentionally, but it becomes feedback that the students interpret as, I'm not as good as someone else, or I'm not good enough to do this. So I'm going to talk a lot about this book, Ungrading, which is fabulous. It's a collection of essays. And in the chapter that he contributed to the book, Jesse Stommel, who's kind of like my hero and my icon of Ungrading, he says that all of what we're doing, if we want to try to create an environment where students don't feel this way, requires two pedagogical approaches. The first one is that we have to begin by trusting our students. And the second one is understanding that fairness is not a good excuse for a lack of compassion. And I think we, as someone who's very justice motivated, I've always been very concerned about being fair to my students. But the more that I learn about equity and how to address equity and create an equitable classroom, the more I understand that fairness may not get us there. Because some people have more complex lives than others. And treating everyone exactly the same doesn't create an environment where students feel like they can succeed. But the thing is, like, we're all naturally curious beings. We come into this world excited to learn. If you've ever been around a kid who's like 5, you know that they are not short on curiosity about the world. A whole lot of time is spent asking how and why over and over and over and over again. So we are naturally curious beings. And somewhere along the way, the students who come into our class, some portion of them lose touch with that curiosity that motivated them as small children to just want to understand the world. And I don't want to, suggest that grades are the reason, because I don't think it's that simple. But there's a lot about our system of education starting very early that takes students away from the excitement of learning and into the more kind of drudgery of learning. So the grade grubbing, the nitpicking. My cousin sent me an email last night in response to something I posted on Facebook that said she had a math teacher in high school who, if the line in her fraction didn't fully cover the number both above and below the fraction line, it would be counted wrong, even if the numbers were correct, because the line had to be exactly the right length to cover the numbers. Like, what did she learn from that? She learned that her teacher is an asshole, right? She didn't learn anything about how to do math. And it's those kinds of things that take our students away from the fun, the joy that we feel about learning, or else we wouldn't be doing this job. So Kevin Gannon, in his book, Radical Hope, that we read last summer, a few of us, says that what gives education vitality, the critical thinking, exploration, creativity, play, and the construction of knowledge is snuffed out by this sort of transactional approach to pedagogy. So Ungrading says, let's eliminate the control-based functions of grades and move towards learning. So away from performance at the expense of learning and toward learning for the sake of learning. So I love this picture of these two girls in a science lab, doing a kind of experiment where there's this wonderful reaction, because you can just see the joy in their faces. And that's the joy that I feel when I talk about my subject. And I suspect it's the joy that many of you feel when you're thinking about or talking about your subject. That's the joy we want to bring back in, and grading can really impede that. So in what ways does that happen? Well, for starters, grades really fail to communicate feedback. They might say how close you were to hitting a mark, but they don't tell you much about why. And there are so many experiments out there, so much research that shows that students will look at the score and then put the paper away. And so if we can delay the reveal of the score long enough for them to read the feedback, then it might be more valuable to them. But that's not how most of us think about grading. Grading creates incentives for students to cheat more, and it reduces their intrinsic motivation by imposing extrinsic rewards and punishments. Grading pits students against each other, which can reduce their sense of belongingness and can undermine the community in a classroom. Although sometimes it might mean that the students come into an adversarial relationship as a group with their teacher, their faculty member. But that again undermines our goal of having a supportive learning environment. And the last thing is that no two people, including me on 2 different days, is ever perfectly consistent in their grading. If I'm grading before I eat lunch, I'm going to grade differently than if I'm grading after I eat lunch. And so this notion that we have to grade so that we're fair somehow is really undermined by the real fact that we can never be perfectly consistent. And once you realize that grading is inherently unfair. And that doesn't mean that there's no role or there's no function for grades, but it does point to some real issues that we have yet to fully grapple with as faculty members. So Kevin Gannon writes this, and I love it. When instructors lament that their students only seem to care about what's on the exam, they fail to see that the emphasis on weeding people out has rendered those grades existentially important for students. We get together and we talk about how students only seem to care about their grades without acknowledging that they've spent 12 or 14 years existing based on what those grades are. We have trained them to care about their grades more than anything else because that's how they get to keep moving forward. So it's no surprise they've responded to the incentive structures that we have created for them. This is so interesting though. Of the top 20 medical schools, 18 of them use only pass-fail grades for preclinical courses, because they have shown that grades in basic science courses have no meaningful correlation with the students' later quality of performance as practicing physicians. I was stunned when I read that in Ungrading, and that's from the editor of the volume, her first chapter. She talks about how 18 of the top 20 medical schools don't have letter grades. So I think we have to ask ourselves then, in our classes, what matters most? And when students are waiting for us to tell them what matters in a class and what to do with the knowledge we give them, they lose agency in the classroom. The learning is not theirs. It's something that they need someone else to give to them, as opposed to something that they are actively doing themselves. So Jesse Stommel writes in Ungrading, there is no room for student agency to breathe in a system of grading, ranking, and scoring. And so we get things like this. right? Students wait until the day something's due and we got to go, 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 because it's all about the performance. So if we want our students to learn, we have to pay attention to the things that are assisting in their learning and do more of that, and things that are interfering with their learning and do fewer of those. And that can be life, that can be all kinds of things, but it also is things that we are doing in our class. So this is from Kevin Gannon in his book, Radical Hope. So this really creates a different kind of teaching. This is not about, I have knowledge to give to you, because when we do that, we take students' agency out of it. We take their curiosity out. We give them a list and say, master this. And for many of you, you might be saying like, that sounds great for you, Liz. Political science, pretty fluffy. People aren't gonna like save or kill people based on the knowledge they get in your class. So I'm glad you're doing that, but I'm just gonna keep doing my thing because I know that it works. But I'm here to tell you that you can. This can work in every kind of class. And here are some ways that it can work. So this is a whole long list. This is heavily borrowed from Jesse's chapter in Ungrading. The PowerPoint slides have more details in the notes. So if you want them, I'm happy to give them to you. And Anita, I'm not sure how these things are being shared later, but I'm also happy to send it to you guys to put on the LibGuide. Grade-free zones might be just like a portion of the semester, maybe like the first third of the semester. It's all feedback and no grades. Or maybe it's just a few assignments that are graded, but not all of them. There could be self-assessment. So this brings in students' metacognition by having them assess their own work and then talking to you about it. That's the biggest thing that I'm doing this semester, is asking students to assess their own work, to reflect on what they've learned, and then talk about, how satisfied are they with that learning. Process letters are where students write a letter describing how their learning and their work evolved over a period of time. Minimal grading would be like, instead of using A, B, C, D, F, it could be you did it or not, pass, fail. Or it could be like a 3 gradation of this was strong, this was satisfactory, this was weak. So maybe it's a less precise grading, so that, the fact that one thing is an 89 and one thing is an 89.5 is a little ridiculous. Minimal grading says we're just going to pretend like those things they're good enough, basically. Authentic assessment is when you do something that's an actual tangible work product. So rather than having students write a research paper, maybe they create a film festival or an exhibition or some sort of thing that shows what they've learned. And then they could have a reflection afterwards where they talk about what they learned and what they got out of that experience. Contract grading is sometimes also called specifications grading. That's a whole sort of middle level. Portfolios, peer assessment, students can make rubrics. So a lot of people who are in this ungrading movement aren't super big fans of rubrics, but there's something really powerful about having the students engage in the learning of constructing a rubric themselves and then evaluating their own work doing that. So when you make this shift from grades to ungrading, there's some language changes, right? Now we're not grading, we're assessing. Now we're not scoring, we're assessing, we're giving feedback. It's very growth mindset-y, because it's all about trying to get better. Jesse has this line in Ungrading that I just love. It's the only thing that I tabbed. He says, we should, in education, it should be about encouraging and rewarding not knowing more than knowing, right? So what's the next question? Where are we going next? For those of you who teach STEM, I want to point you to Clarissa Sorensen Unruh, who has she's a chemistry professor. She's embraced ungrading. She's got a series of blog posts about it. And I don't think I can copy that URL, but It's in the PowerPoint if you want to get that. She has some really great resources about how she's managed to do that. And it can be done. It can be done in math. There are mathematicians who have embraced ungrading. And these are some of the things that come as a result. It's lower stress for students and for you, because it's not about making those sometimes somewhat arbitrary distinctions between, you know, an 89 and a 90 or a 72 and a 74. It's more about how can I use my feedback to help you improve. It really does give the students the power to take control of their own learning. And that works towards I think our goal in higher education, which is to create lifelong learners. When students can start doing that now with you as their coach, then they can create the habits that will continue beyond their time in our classes. Ungrading really does unleash students' creativity. I have seen some amazing examples that I'd be happy to share with you anytime of students doing really amazing things. And I know Skylar does this really, really well in her classes as well. Students just doing amazingly creative stuff. And ungrading means that now my time isn't spent on grading a stack of papers. It's more about a conversation that evolves over the semester about what you're learning and what that makes you want to know more about next. And it also opens up all kinds of really interesting course design possibilities. So I just think that this is a really exciting pedagogy. It's a really exciting way to think about relating to students and relating to the work. And so I've got a whole bunch of book covers here. I haven't read them all, and I will confess that Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I made it like 4 sentences into and just could not. But everybody else on this page cites him. So I'm just, you know, like sort of secondarily recommending Paulo Freire's book, but Teaching to Transgress, the Ungrading book, Radical Hope. Those are all fantastic. Cheating Lessons, a small group of us are reading this semester. Susan Bloom, who edited Ungrading, also wrote this book called I Love Learning, I Hate School, an anthropology of college, that talks about some of the reasons that students get frustrated with college specifically. So there's some really good resources here. And then Jesse Stommel and Susan Bloom are very active on Twitter, and I've got some other links in the PowerPoint that I'm happy to share. But these are the kinds of things that I think kind of come clustered with this idea of ungrading. And again, I think it's a big leap to go from a traditionally graded course to fully ungrading. So I don't expect anybody to do that, but I think that there are some nuggets here that we can start to introduce and then evolve towards a more relationship-focused, student-centered pedagogy in our classes. With this change to 7-week classes, I think we have a real opportunity to experiment with some of these things to make our lives and our students' lives less frenetic. And so if you decide that you want to give it a shot, I hope you'll reach out to me or someone else and kind of talk through it. Like I said, Bill Taylor is doing some of this work. I know Nancy Schur has read Ungrading. There may be others that I don't know about. I just know about those two because we talk fairly often. So what questions or thoughts do you guys have? And I know if you have to leave, please do so, but what kinds of things are you thinking about?
Can you show us some examples of how you've structured the things in one of your classes where you've been the most successful with that? Because for me, that's one of the parts where I have a hard time, is just visualizing what I know is typical, all the things I've tried, and then what people have done successfully.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Tanya. So I am not doing ungrading in any of my American government classes this semester because I'm doing the persistence project and, you know, don't taint the data. But my comparative world politics class this semester, which is half honor students, half not, is fully ungraded. So I just tell them, I expect you to do these things. And I expect you to do them by this day or really soon thereafter. Because if you don't do that, then your classmates can't do what they need to do. And then at the end of the semester, we're going to have a conference where we talk about what you've done, and you're going to assign yourself a grade. I had midterm conferences with all of those students as well, and they assigned themselves a grade. And, you know, for the most part, I thought they were pretty fair. Some were harder on themselves than I would have been. And so I would say, you know, if I were assigning a grade and I'm not, I would have given you an A, not a B, but you gave yourself a B. So I'm going to respect that. There was another student who gave himself a B who clearly, I don't think under a traditional grading mindset had earned it. But I said, okay, well, you know, ungrading means you get to give yourself your own grade. But I'm telling you that if you maintain the level of work you've been doing at the end of the semester, we're going to have a much more in-depth conversation about why you think that's the right grade for you. But it's really just, you know, to Phil's question, is there a rubric? No, it's think about the work you've done and think about how much you've learned. And then assign yourself a grade based on the progress that you have made since the start of the semester. That's how I framed it. Most people who self-grade, and in the book Ungrading, there are some really good examples where most people who do this will have students do a self-assessment first. So they'll kind of do a worksheet where they, you know, reflect on, you know, what percentage of the readings did you do? What percentage of the assignments did you do? What was something you learned? What was hard for you? What was easy for you? So it kind of steps them through that before they assign themselves a grade. Now, in terms of Angie's question, how hard is the transition in mindset? Incredibly difficult, because students, you have to build the trust so that they don't assume that 6 weeks into this, you're going to pull the rug out from underneath them, because that's what the system has trained them to believe, right? And so a big part of that for me was, for every student, I asked every single student this semester, regardless of whether I'm ungrading or not, I asked them to fill out a midterm self-reflection where they gave themselves a grade. And for the most part, that's the grade that I submitted as their midterm grade. And so I was hoping that that would help build some trust around that you can trust me, that, you know, I will tell you if I think you're not doing enough. So if you don't hear from me, that means you're good. And, you know, the way that I'm giving feedback is a whole lot of very tiny, tiny pieces of communication that over time accumulate into nearly constant back and forth between the students and I.
So you're not spending a lot of time grading, but you're spending a crap ton of time giving very specific, useful feedback.
Right. Mostly just cheerleading and saying, I love that you did that. You might also go look at this other thing and, you know, tell me more about how you make sense of this, because I'm still struggling with how to make sense of this. Those kinds of things. So it's a conversation, and the students have broad leeway to pursue what they want to know more about, because I can't cover all of American government in 14 or 15 weeks. And so, you know, I'm going to make sure that they understand the very basics of how the thing works, but then what they learn more about, it's wide open. Anything goes. Like, chase your curiosities and then come tell us what you found out. Now, there's not a second class. There's not like Calc 2 or ANP 2 for American government. So I don't, you know, I recognize that this very loosey-goosey course design would be harder for people who have a Part 2, but I think it can be done.
So when you have students who are nearing the end of the semester and are not completing the things, how does that pan out for them?
Well, this is my first semester, so I don't know. Generally speaking, people who take my classes either get A's and B's or F's. There's not a lot of C's and D's in my class. they do the work or they don't. And I think that's probably going to be the same. I do think that students are, you know, at least from what I've seen so far, largely doing more work than they have in previous semesters. They're reading more. You know, my world politics class that I'm fully ungrading, I give them a choice of like 7 to 10 things that they can choose to do for each unit. And I just expected that they would all choose the shortest and easiest ones, and they didn't. And I am stunned by, and it's not just the honor students. It's students who in previous classes with me have gotten, you know, who are like low B, high C students. And they're doing more because they're, yeah, Phil, because they're curious. They're interested.
Liz, you're giving them options.
Yes,
Really
so many options.
And it meets, you know, different learning styles too, different ways they can express their learning. That's really important.
Mhm.
You know, in the past, as an English teacher, I did a lot of portfolio assessment, and I allowed students just to write and put together a portfolio, and we would conference around their best work. You know, and you have some sort of learning objectives, you know, we have to have that, I guess, but I love this idea. Thank you so much for sharing all this. This is giving me a lot of food for thought.
Yeah, so Angie, in world politics, there are 5 units. We all started with the same book. So unit 1 was the same book for everybody. It was Hans Rosling's Factfulness, which I heard about from you. And then the other 4 units, they had a very long list of options. And they chose one book or other thing to read or explore for each of those other 4 units. So for the last unit, one of the options is Born a Crime, and probably half the class has chosen that one too, which is also your recommendation. Well, thank you all for being here. If you have other questions, you ever want to talk about this, I love talking about teaching. So just reach out, it'd make me so happy. For those of you who came, I'll try to remember later today to send you the PowerPoint with the, it has all of the resources and quotes and links and stuff embedded so you can get a little bit more. But tell your friends and experiment, and then tell us, right? Like it's just like what I tell my students, get curious, try some stuff, and then tell us what you learned. So Tanya, I've done a little bit of specifications grading.